Thanks for joining us today for part 2 of our interview with Dr. Stephen Grcevich. As a reminder, Dr. Grcevich is the founder and president of Key Ministry. He's also a board-certified child and adolescent psychiatrist who is a past recipient of the Exemplary Psychiatrist Award from the National Alliance on Mental Illness, and he is the author of Mental Health in the Church. Today, we're going to continue our discussion on how we can support all students at church with a focus on students who have oppositional defiant disorder. So glad you're here today. Let's jump back in.
So let's switch gears here for just a second and let's start talking about oppositional defiant disorder. So this is something that we often see questions about from ministry leaders on how to handle a child who may have some anger issues or who may be very defiant. What do leaders need to know about this?
Okay, so when you talk about oppositional defiant disorder, I will admit that I'm a bit of a skeptic about this.
Okay.
In that that I'm not sure that they should have included this as a diagnostic category in the DSM, because kids who are rigid and inflexible and disrespectful and defiant, we see this cut across a variety of different conditions. And that when I see folks as a clinician, it's more important for me to try to understand sort of the quality and the nature of the defiance to figure out how to help. So, we just got done spending a lot of time talking about ADHD, and here's an interesting backstory to this whole issue with oppositional defiant disorder. That the company that I had done some original research with, and they were the folks who made Adderall at the time, actually looked at getting their drug approved to treat kids with oppositional defiant disorder. And so that there was a group up at Harvard that they commissioned to design a study looking at this. And one of the things that they had found was that that in fact, using somewhat higher doses of medicine than what they would typically use in ADHD studies, that they saw a significant reduction in the extent, the specific target behaviors that they were looking at. So the FDA takes a look at this and they say, we don't believe that this is an actual condition because 85% of the kids in your oppositional defiant disorder study had ADHD. They told them, repeat your study. If you replicate the same results with 300 kids with oppositional defiant disorder who don't have ADHD, we'll give you the indication. And at the time, having the extra 6 months worth of patent protection associated with that indication would have generated about another $500 million for the pharmaceutical company that's developing it. They couldn't find those 300 kids, so that they were never able to get it for that because, disentangling like the oppositional defiant disorder from what we think about as ADHD is such a significant challenge. One of the newest diagnostic entities that came into the DSM 10 years ago is something called disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, or DMD. Having served on like the new research committee at the Child Psychiatry Academy with the woman at NIMH who shepherded a lot of this research, it turns out, and when you talk about DMDD, you're talking about these kids who have like these severe protracted meltdowns, typically like 3 or more in a week that will last anywhere from like 30 minutes to 4 hours.
Right.
And that 85% of those kids have oppositional defiant disorder, and so that, one of the things that I wrestle with as a clinician is, exactly what is this?
Right.
Because there may be, again, differences in certain underlying attributes or traits that cause it to be associated so frequently with these other diagnoses that contribute to the rigid, disrespectful, disobedient, socially inappropriate behavior. But what you do about it is very different depending upon, the context in which it occurs,
Right.
and what's going on inside that kid's brain when they start responding inappropriately to requests from adults.
Right. So if I'm hearing you correctly, if you are a church leader and you've been told when you have a student with oppositional defiant disorder, that perhaps instead of getting stuck on that, because I think sometimes when people hear that, then all of a sudden they kind of paint a picture of what it's going to be like, which may or may not be accurate. And instead of thinking about that, really thinking about more like what are the challenges and what is the root of why that is a challenge for that child? Because I think I read in one of your blog posts that it said students who struggle with anger, who sometimes have been diagnosed with ODD, often have different roots, opposite roots of why that anger is occurring. Could you talk a little bit more about that? I thought that was so important.
Okay, so when I have a family who has a kid who's, angry, defiant, sometimes like having these meltdowns, one of the questions that I'll ask them to kind of figure out like what we're going to do about it is, what percentage of the time when your kid is defiant, is it an immediate response to a question or a request where they're saying no almost before they've had time to think about what they're saying no to? Versus to what extent is their defiance something that is based upon them being rigid and inflexible, and the extent of their defiance tends to increase over like minutes or even an hour. Because like the first group, the kids who are, like immediately impulsively defiant, that overlaps with a lot of the characteristics that we see in kids with ADHD. We know that like among like the executive functions, one that kids with ADHD struggle with is emotional self-regulation. They also struggle significantly with impulse control. So when they're saying no without thinking about what they're saying no to, we oftentimes respond to that by thinking about some of the kinds of interventions that are helpful for kids with ADHD. On the other hand, if you have a kid, and this is something that maps out over time. So when you follow these kids out developmentally, these are kids who tend to, as they get into adulthood, have more problems with anxiety and depression. If we have a kid who's defiant because they're thinking too much about a request, or they have a picture in their mind's eye of how a certain situation should unfold, and it's not going the way that they want, they oftentimes become defiant when their internal frustration about that kind of bubbles over. And so that we have to deal with that in a very different way, where oftentimes, what we're trying to do is reduce stimulation, in the kid who has, ADHD and executive functioning struggles. For the latter kid, where they're thinking too much about it, we try to distract them and give them something else to think about to take their mind off of the thing that's frustrating them and fueling their defiance.
So let's unpack that a little bit, because I think this is really important. So if you are a ministry leader and you have a child who frequently is defiant and maybe has some anger issues, what are the filter questions you want to start with to kind of determine what is the root?
So one of the things that I would, that I think is a concept that we can teach to like children's ministry leaders, I think that you can even teach this to like people who are like regular Sunday school volunteers, that I would borrow a little bit from sort of the autism community is sort of the notion of ABC, antecedent behavior consequence. So that like, so if you're seeing a kid who's struggling, with a specific behavior, for example, at church, what's the context in which that behavior tends to be a problem? What's going on immediately before they start to exhibit the behavior?
Right.
What's the nature of the activity? What kind of space are they in? How structured is it? Are there certain things that appear to be triggers to that behavior? Are they defiant with everybody? Are they defiant only with certain people and only during certain activities? and then looking at, well, how do people respond to that behavior? And are there, and are there some ways maybe which, other people who are in that environment, maybe inadvertently like rewarding or reinforcing that behavior, would be a way of thinking about it. So again, we're not thinking about diagnosis at any point here. We're just observing, what are they struggling with? What's going on at the time that they're having the struggle that could potentially be a contributing factor? And are there some things that we can do like on the back end of this in response to it that'll help them to be able to like pull it together and re-engage with like whatever, activity they happen to be involved with at church at the time?
Yeah. So in our ministry, we like to call that being a behavior detective. So that when there's the problem, you ask what happened immediately before the behaviors, and then what is the behavior trying to gain? What are they trying to gain through it? So if people can find like what might have happened, what should they do then? If they can kind of get an idea, like maybe they're upset about this or this, what is the next thing they should do in the moment?
So, so again, like the kind of thing that you might think about, again, is going back and asking the parent, when you have this situation at home, what have you found to be effective in dealing with that? You start observing, are there kids who maybe are having more of an issue in certain environments with this? That sometimes, again, that there can be other emotional issues, going on. And I'll give you an example of a kid from my practice that this family they were checking out a new church in our area where, it's very popular, nationally recognized. But one of the things that this kid had heard from other kids at school was that you don't get to stay with your parents at this church, and that they expect you to do all of the stuff with peers your age. And so when they got to the church, this girl literally started arguing with her parents to the point that they were wrestling on the pavement in the parking lot. And so, when you started sort of like digging around, one of the things that came out, like, again, being the detective, is that this girl all had lots of issues with separation anxiety. And the defiance came from her fear of going into an unfamiliar situation with unfamiliar people judging her and her parents not immediately available to her. So that it's what you learn when you're doing your detective work that is going to help you figure out the things that you're going to do to help that kid be more successful, in your Sunday school class, in your vacation Bible school, like wherever it happens to be that you're serving at the time.
Right. So when you see a child who is struggling with defiance or anger, I think a lot of times church leaders go on the defensive right away. Sometimes people personalize that. How important is it for them to recognize that this is a child who is struggling and that there may be things underneath like fear that if they knew, it would change the way they approach them?
Well, it's really important, going back and citing that study we talked about, like, at the onset of like our initial conversation, that having oppositional defiant disorder makes it 55% less likely that family's going to set foot in church. That, and given that it probably impacts 3 to 5% of the school age population in the United States, that's a lot of families that are missing out on getting a chance to, to hear the gospel preached every week, and are missing out on Christian community, and missing out, and those are volunteers and people, who have gifts for your church that you're missing out on. If you're not willing to, to think about addressing these issues and figuring out why it is that they have problems that cause them to be a part of church, but they're able to function, at school during the week, and in other activities in the community.
Right.
I mean, this is a population that's too big to ignore.
Right.
and when I think about all the statistics recently, about how many churches are struggling to recapture attendance after COVID.
Right.
When you think about the fact that 20% of school-age kids have at least one mental health condition, and that those conditions are so likely to keep their families away from church, if I'm a lead pastor, an executive pastor, I'm looking at them as sort of a place to target our resources in terms of evangelism and outreach.
Yeah, you and I speak the same language on that. I agree 100%. But going back, kind of what I'm hearing you say is a great way to handle this if you have a child who is having a lot of anger defiance, is to kind of look at the big picture to see, is there patterns from what's happening before they're getting upset, and talking to the parents in a compassionate and kind way and asking for what is helpful at school or at home and kind of working a plan, which I always think is the best way to approach children who are having challenging behavior. But what about in that moment? If you are in church and you have a student who is all of a sudden getting angry, or they're getting angry and you don't have time to look back, what are some best practices on how that leader should approach that child?
Okay, so one of the things that oftentimes, we would think about doing, is, sort of coming back to, our computer without enough RAM analogy. If it's an immediate, instant kind of reaction to something that you didn't see coming, one of the things, and this is a challenge in some churches because, space tends to be at a premium. But if you have the opportunity to have sort of designated spaces that are maybe less, where they are more quiet, there's a little less sensory stimulation, and it's out of the way, so that other people can't necessarily see when a child's having a problem, that can be something that's really helpful. Again, we don't want volunteers in a situation where they're alone with a child.
Absolutely.
So that, like, one of the strategies that some of the churches that that we work with use is a notion of floating buddies. Where maybe they have some extra people around who aren't assigned to a particular child, who can come and help in a situation where maybe kids need to de-escalate. One of the things that we know when kids oftentimes start having challenges with emotional self-regulation is that the awareness that other people are seeing them when they are out of control makes it worse. And so that, to the extent that we can try to give them, a little bit of privacy, the less stuff they have to process, the easier it is for them to use the cognitive capacity that they have, to manage the situation in the moment. So that one of the things I would encourage, like, volunteers and even like parents listening to think about. A question I get all the time from parents when they bring in a kid who has these kinds of issues is, can they or can't they control it?
Right.
The better question is, they can, but they have to develop much more of their cognitive resources to doing it than you would see with a kid who doesn't have this particular condition.
Right.
And so that, the response to it then is, how do we think about helping them by, allowing them to devote the resources that they have, to the challenge that's getting in the way of them doing what they need to do in the moment.
Right. So is that kind of where that universal design, that how you put your environment together, the structure and the different things kind of comes into play?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that's a good place and sort of a good way to think about, the stuff that, Barb Newman and now Tori White are talking about, when they think about, basically creating cultures of inclusion. One of the things that we did very separately when we started thinking about, like, this notion of mental health inclusion is that this is a mindset as opposed to a program.
Right.
That we're trying to work with churches and train leaders and volunteers, in a pattern of thinking as opposed to setting up something that's separate.
Right.
You know, we want to include people, or when I walk into a church and I'm meeting with a leadership team, one of the first questions I ask is, what's your discipleship strategy? Because our job then is to help them think about, when they look at the specific activities that they think are most important in spiritual growth, what is it that we need to train or share with the people leading those activities, to the volunteers who are, engaged in those activities, to be able to help these folks fully participate, in those things that the church's leadership have seen, as being most crucial to spiritual growth.
Yeah.
So it's a mindset.
Yeah. And I would think that part of that, now I've not looked at any studies or anything, but I think one of the basic parts of that discipleship starts with making them feel wanted there. Because I think a lot of times when you are talking about children who have had challenges with behavior, especially if it is defiance or anger, which often stem from fear and feeling out of control. But I think when we see that a lot, they almost sometimes go into an environment ready to be rejected. And so I think if you really want to disciple someone, you first need to make sure that they feel welcome with just like a big smile and a big, I'm so glad you're here. And after a difficulty, kind of coming back and letting them know that they're still important.
Well, it's interesting. Okay, I think that there are two things I would think about, in response to what you just said. Feeling welcome is part of it. Feeling safe is the other part of it.
Very well said.
In that, back when I was working in community mental health, the most challenging kids that I had to treat with these kinds of conditions were kids who had been through multiple adverse childhood experiences. Because one of the things that happens is that, the connections between the prefrontal cortex in your brain that's involved with executive functioning, and the limbic system, which is involved with managing emotion, the connections don't form properly and don't work properly, and so that, like, a lot of times kids who've experienced multiple traumas have problems with that sort of top-down control, and our medicines don't work real well because our medicines are based upon neurotransmitters. The problems that they have are based upon connectivity in the brain. And so, so as you were talking about this, there was a large and very well-known church that we were doing some consulting with that has a significant number of kids who were sex trafficked, and so, and so that they have a lot of, issues with, focus, concentration, defiance, but there's also this whole trauma component that, kind of comes into it too, and so, so that part of what, a way of thinking about it, because, we don't know what kind of baggage all of these kids and these families are bringing when they come to us, is that we have to make them feel welcome, but we also have to make them feel safe.
Yeah, that is so well said. Absolutely. Safety first, making people feel safe is really important. Is there anything else that you would want church leaders and volunteers to understand about children who struggle with anger or defiance or ODD?
Again, it's really complicated. Like, when I'm teaching, like, my, residents or fellows, like, the list of different conditions that can contribute to kids having these issues is as long as my arm.
Yeah.
Our job is, to share the love of Christ with them, to introduce them to the gospel, to be able to give them opportunities to serve, and that we need to do, I think that the notion of, making sure that folks feel welcome, making sure that folks feel safe, creating the kinds of environments that allow them, to be able to learn and to be able to grow. And then finally, to not assume that the challenges that they're having managing their emotions or their behavior, are a result of, some lack of spiritual maturity, or in particular, aren't associated with lax parenting, is something that's critically important. One of the areas where we get involved fairly often, and where I see a lot of overlap with our ministry and other ministry, are churches that are doing adoption and foster care ministry.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And there are parents who serve heroically, in those environments where, the kids that they're working with, have been so damaged by things that they've experienced in the world, that it's all that they can do to support them through the day. And so that, that our job isn't to, to judge where they're at, where their parents are at spiritually, to judge their parents' motivation. Our job is to introduce them, to Jesus.
Right.
And, and to help them to be able to take the next step in their spiritual growth.
Yes, I love that. So one more question for you, Dr. Grcevich. Coming back to Key Ministry, can you tell us a little bit about how your journey through this mission of helping people with hidden disabilities go to church, how has that impacted your faith, your personal faith journey?
One of the things that I wonder about, interestingly enough, is, because of like the nature of what we do, and when we were thinking about this mental health inclusion model, I spent a lot of time studying churches, because I have to be able to communicate this in such a way that a senior pastor, an executive pastor, will buy into it, see the need for it, and have it fit within like their model of how they do church.
Right.
One of the things that I've become most aware of, and one of the things that I actually get the most gratification out of as a ministry leader, is the opportunities that we at Key Ministry give other people to be able to serve and to use their gifts.
Right.
That if I were running a church, one of the reasons why I think that we lose so many people is that, and I was talking about this with one of the guys who had been one of our founding board members and an elder at our church, is that in too many places, church is like playing on a football team where you have practice and film study, but you never get to play in a game. In that, that where, in terms of like, my own life as a Christian, when you start trying to do things to advance the kingdom, you get the attention of the enemy, and, I tell folks like, that if you're being left alone, it's because you're not in a position where you're a threat to score for God's team. When God starts using you to do significant things, you get the attention of the other side very quickly. And, it's in the doing that one, has to, that causes you to like get into scripture, to dig deep, to get serious about praying. And that, and that there are times that I wonder whether we as an organization have been more helpful in terms of helping church lead people to Christ, or helping folks who had already know Christ deepen in their walk, because we're giving them opportunities to be able to use their gifts and talents, and, particularly those of us who are not, professional Christians, shall we say, that there are too many places where I think that, maybe because of feeling threatened in some instances, the church leaders are, reluctant to let people do ministry. I was extraordinarily blessed to be part of a church that when their most junior elder had this really crazy idea, that the church stepped up, rallied around that, contributed board members, contributed seed money, and we're willing to do some things to make that vision a reality. Um, that what I have found most gratifying about this is, seeing folks in the way that it's impacted those who have an opportunity to be able to serve in ministry, and the people who serve in ministry in relative silence. So that I'm not sure when you're going to share this podcast, but in several months there's this National Disability Ministry Conference that we do called Disability in the Church, where you are going to be one of our speakers this coming. It's the last weekend in April in 2023. And there are folks who do a lot of work in this area, but in relative obscurity, and they never get to get invited to the cool kid conferences. Right. And it's seeing folks get an opportunity to sort of share their ideas and network with other people who are leaders in the field that is, really gratifying. That when we think about our operating principles as a ministry, after having been excluded from certain forums early on because we maybe rubbed some people the wrong way, or we were giving our stuff away for free, which some folks had some issues with. That part of our operating principle has been that everybody gets to play. Yeah. And so it's giving other people platforms to be able to do ministry and to share with other people that are doing ministry, that I think has been most gratifying over the last 20 years.
Yeah, well, I agree. Since I've started in this, just this whole community of leaders who work together for a common mission has been really energizing and just beautiful to watch. And just to put a plug out,
unusual in church world to see folks get along as well and mutually support each other, as well as the folks involved, I think, with the disability ministry movement have. And thinking about this the other day, I think it's because it's been so grassroots, and that so much of this has, started by, parents or family members of somebody who had a struggle, or the church leaders that were personally impacted by this.
Right.
That, because it's been very much sort of a bottom up kind of movement, a rising tide lifts all boats. And it's a great illustration, I think, of how the kingdom's supposed to work. God gets the glory.
I agree. Yeah.
I tell the other ministry organizations, when everybody's saved, we can fight over market share. But until then, Jesus gives us all plenty of stuff to do.
Yes, he certainly does. So, and I just want to put a plug out for the conference in April. So I went to your conference last year, and it is a fabulous conference. There is something for everyone who wants to learn more about disability in the church, from the ministry leadership side to the family side to the volunteer side. It's just a really worthwhile event. So I hope people will sign up.
Yeah, so if they go to keyministry.org, you can register from the homepage on our website at this point. We have over 80 speakers confirmed for this year, which is more than we've ever had before.
Wow.
And for folks who can't come in person, we make all of our main stage sessions freely available and live stream over the internet. But sometimes you just need to be in the presence of other Christ followers who share the same values that you do. And there's a great deal of value in terms of being able to spend a couple of days with folks who, who care about the same thing you do and have the same ministry call that you do. Yeah. So that I want to see as many of our friends as possible, get together in Cleveland the last weekend in April, because there have been too few opportunities to do this over the last few years.
Absolutely. Well, I hope people will come, because it was really just an inspiring weekend. I learned so much. I made good friends with people, because there is nothing, you just can't replace being in person with other people. So we will, well, Dr. Grcevich, thank you so much for joining us today. We have learned so much, and we'll make sure we'll share your resources in our group. And just thank you so much for being here today.
Well, thank you for how you serve, Barb. Appreciate having the opportunity to share.
Thank you.
If you'd like to hear more from Dr. Stephen Grcevich, we hope that you'll check out part 1 of our interview about ADHD and the church, available on our YouTube channel or in our Facebook group. Thanks for joining us today. See you next time.